Soup is one of my favorite types of food to eat because it's so cozy and it just warms your soul. So especially as we're entering into fall, we are officially in soup season. So in today's video, I'm gonna be sharing 3 of my favorite soups to eat in the fall. This first recipe is definitely one of my favorites. It is a kale and chicken sausage soup. So I do want to mention a recommendation for the sausage that I'm going to be using in this recipe. Personally, I recommend using a nitrate and nitrite-free sausage. Nitrates and nitrites are preservatives that are oftentimes added to processed meats, such as sausages and other cured meats like bacon and lunch meat. And when they're heated to high temperatures, it can become carcinogenic, which means it can increase our risk of cancer. So I definitely recommend a nitrate-free sausage for this recipe, or if you want to try a vegan version, you can skip the sausage altogether and use something like lentils instead. To get started, I'm going to start by chopping up my red onion and putting that in a large pot with a little bit of grass-fed ghee. I'm going to heat this over high temperature and let that simmer down a little bit. And while that's simmering, I'm going to chop up my chicken into slices. I'm going to add the chicken sausage in the pot and also let that cook for a couple minutes while it releases some good fragrant smells into the air. And then I'm going to deglaze the pot by pouring in some broth. I recommend using bone broth because bone broth is really rich in an amino acid called L-glutamine. And L-glutamine is very beneficial and protective for our gastrointestinal system. So especially if you struggle with anything like IBS or celiac disease or GERD, I would recommend bone broth. It's very gentle and it adds a lot of protein and it's just really delicious. While the sausage and onions are cooking down, I'm gonna get started chopping up my other vegetables. So I'm gonna chop up my potatoes and kale and garlic. Potatoes are actually one of my personal favorite foods in this whole world because they're so delicious and heartwarming, but they're also my favorite version of a superfood. I know everybody talks about kale being the superfood, but actually I love potatoes because they're so rich in minerals. Potassium is a great example, and potassium is really important for our heart function. They're also a great source of multiple different B vitamins, and B vitamins are really important when it comes to energy production. So potatoes, definitely include it in this soup. It just makes it that much better. Adding in the broth is one of my favorite parts because you get to see that beautiful deglazing happen. So go ahead and pour the broth in and then add those chopped potatoes and let that come to a boil for a little bit. The potatoes need a little bit longer to cook, so while those are cooking, we will finish cutting up our kale and our garlic. For the seasonings, I'm just gonna be using some fresh herbs. I'm gonna be using oregano and some thyme. I know this thyme plant looks really sad, but it's just dried thyme, so I'm still gonna use it. And then I'm also gonna sprinkle in some dried basil, and then of course some salt and pepper as well. I also decided to add a pinch of paprika as well. The amazing thing about soups is that it's very hard to mess it up. So I encourage you to try adding whatever kind of seasonings you enjoy. You really can't go wrong with soup. As long as there's some good vegetables and good salt in there, it's gonna taste amazing. So now I get to taste it and see how it's coming along. It needs a little more salt. That's much better, but I definitely feel like we need something a little bit spicy in here. So I'm gonna add a pinch of cayenne and some red pepper chili flakes as well. If you don't like spicy food, you can definitely exclude this, but if you do like a little bit of a kick, I would say add it in because it's gonna be amazing. Oh yeah. Much better with a little spice in there. Definitely good. This next soup is going to be an enchilada inspired soup. It's pretty similar to a chicken tortilla soup, but I've actually always preferred my chicken tortilla soup without the chicken. So I've kind of made an enchilada soup instead so that there's no chicken, it's just all the good veggies and more of an enchilada sauce broth. start with the enchilada sauce, I'm gonna start by de-stemming some of these chili peppers and getting a lot of those seeds out of there. And then we're gonna soak it in a bowl of purified water for about 5 minutes. So for the ingredients, I'm going to be using pretty much whatever I would put in regular enchiladas. So I've got some rice and beans, I've got lots of peppers, especially these green peppers. This was actually a gift from my friend Julie. These came straight from her garden. So I'm really excited to try some of these. I believe they're poblano peppers. And then for the rice and beans, these are such a great food to have. They are filled with resistant starches, and resistant starch is excellent fiber for our gut health. It gives our good bacteria something to feed on and grow the good bacteria in our gut, and that's a really important part of our immune system. So definitely include some legumes in there. I'm using red kidney beans. You could use lentils, black beans, pinto beans, really whatever you have on hand. So I will get started. I'm gonna start chopping up my onions so I can throw those in the pan to start sauteing those with some garlic. Then I'm gonna chop up my red bell pepper, my poblanos, my orange bell pepper, pretty much throw all of that in the pot. Peppers are an excellent source of vitamin C, especially whenever you're eating them raw. That's probably the best way to get the most out of the vitamin C. Once it's heated, it'll cut that content down a little bit, but not significantly. So still a good source of vitamin C. Great for our immune system, especially in the fall as we're entering flu season. Always get those good vitamin C rich foods into your diet. If you want to know a secret to making your food taste amazing, always start your dish by sauteing some onions with a little bit of garlic. I promise you it's going to make your meal taste 1,000 times better. You might notice that's kind of how I start all of my dishes, and especially with soup, I would definitely recommend starting with that rather than just dumping the broth in and dumping everything else in. Because when you start with that sauteing, the pan gets a little glazed, and then whenever we dump in our broth, that does something called deglazing the pot, and that deglazing brings in a lot of those deep roasted, toasted kind of flavors into that broth. So always start with your garlic and onions, sauteing those, and definitely use fresh whenever you can rather than powdered. Fresh is gonna make it taste way better. For the enchilada sauce, we're gonna take our chilies that have been soaking and we're going to put those in either a blender or a food processor. And then the water that the chilies have been soaking in, we're also gonna use that. And then we're going to add either a can of tomato paste or tomato sauce or a can of tomatoes. Add all of that to your blender or food processor and then blend it up until it's nice and pureed. And then this enchilada sauce is what we're going to kind of deglaze our pot with. Before we deglaze the pot, I'm going to pour in my spices, let it kind of get fragrant. You should start smelling those spices, and then that's when we're gonna dump in our enchilada sauce, and then it's gonna become the most amazing broth and base for this soup. And then you can fill up the pot about halfway with your vegetable broth or chicken broth or just regular water to get enough soup to eat. If you want to make your soup a little more hearty, you can add in some brown rice or quinoa as well. I'm actually really sad that I don't have quinoa currently, so I'm going to use brown rice. But quinoa is a great one, especially for some plant-based protein. Quinoa is one of the few sources of complete proteins that comes from a plant, meaning it has all the essential amino acids that we need to get from our diet. So quinoa is a great option for this. It also cooks really quick, but I'm just going to be using some brown rice because that's what I have on hand. Once we've added all of our ingredients into the pot, pretty much just gonna cover it and let it cook down until everything is cooked through. If you don't have the rice or quinoa in there, it's only gonna take about 10 minutes. If you do add the rice or quinoa, that's gonna add on about 20 to 25 extra minutes to let that cook until it's tender. Once all of the ingredients have cooked down and the rice or quinoa is nice and soft, you can go ahead and serve it. I topped it with a little bit of some tortilla chips with a little cilantro as well. And then it's time to enjoy. This last recipe is so easy. It's for homemade tomato basil soup. Growing up, I used to eat this all the time, especially when I was sick. My mom would always give me a bowl of tomato soup with a side of grilled cheese, and it was like one of my favorite meals ever. And as an adult, I've graduated into a little bit more homemade version, but it's just as easy. So Ditch the Campbell's canned tomato soup. I'm sorry to say it, but just make it yourself. It's so much better and literally takes like 5 minutes. And all you need is some tomatoes or a can of tomatoes, garlic and onions, a little bit of basil, and it's literally the best thing ever. So there's actually 2 ways to make this recipe. There's a really easy way, which is how I do it, and then there's a more complicated way where you use real fresh tomatoes and then throw those in the oven, let them get roasted. I'm gonna show you the easy way because this is how I do it 9 times out of 10 because it's so quick and easy. So I just use a can of diced tomatoes, and I actually bought crushed tomatoes, so that's what I'm using today. Usually I just use diced tomatoes, really doesn't matter. You can use any kind of can of tomatoes that you have for the simple quick version. If you wanna do the version where you roast the tomatoes and everything, that's fine too, but this is the easy version. This is what I'm gonna be showing you. So we'll get started by chopping up our onions. I like to use a white or a yellow onion for this. And then I'm going to throw that onion into the pot with some grass-fed ghee. You could also use oil or whatever you have on hand. The key to making this soup extra delicious is really in how we cook up the garlic and onions first. So I use about 3 or 4 cloves of garlic, and then the oil is also a big player in how our soup is gonna taste in the end. So I like to use grass-fed ghee. It kind of gives it that butter taste without the lactose and casein, which is what a lot of people are sensitive to in dairy products. So that's why I use grass-fed ghee. It's also great under higher temperature cooking, means it's not going to oxidize, which damages the fat. After the garlic and onions cook for about 5 minutes, I'm gonna deglaze my pot with my broth. I am using bone broth for this recipe. I've talked about the benefits of bone broth previously, but doing that for some extra protein in this recipe. Really, since we're just using tomatoes, there's not a lot of protein unless we add some protein in. So that's where bone broth comes in hand. It also adds that really well-rounded, balanced flavor profile as well. For the herbs and seasonings for this soup, it's super easy. Really, basil is our main character here. So I'm gonna be using some fresh basil as well as some oregano. I always recommend adding herbs to your food. It's such an easy way to really enhance your antioxidant and vitamin content in your food. I think herbs are one of the most underestimated ways to increase our overall nutrient profile. So whether you have dried or fresh herbs, add those herbs to your food. Of course, with the fresh herbs, we are gonna get a little bit higher vitamins and antioxidants, but dried herbs still carry that as well too. So always add herbs to your food, and it just smells amazing, makes it taste good. Once all of our flavors have been blending together for like 5 minutes, that's when I'm gonna bust out my immersion blender. You can buy one of these on Amazon for like $30. If you don't have one, I would say turn off the heat to your soup, let it cool a little bit, and then blend it up in whatever kind of blender you do have. The immersion blender is great because you can use it directly into your pot. So the soup really only needs to cook and get all those flavors together for about 5 minutes, and then we'll use our immersion blender and blend it all till it's smooth. And I'm gonna blend it on about the medium setting. On this one, I'm gonna blend it on the number 4 setting. Once everything is blended together, it's time to enjoy your homemade tomato basil soup. I hope you guys enjoyed these recipes. I know I definitely enjoyed eating all of them after we cooked all of this. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give me a thumbs up and subscribe for more.